Hello and welcome folks to Agathos Flight School. I'm happy and excited to present you this new video, a comparison of a real Mustang, a TF51D versus DCS and IL2 Battle of Bodenplatte. For the comparison I have chosen three sequences. One is a taxi sequence, one is a takeoff, and the last and final third one is a landing. Before we just go into the comparison, we don't need to actually talk a lot about taxiing. The engine is running off the real plane, and so let's just hop directly into the footage of the real plane. Here, note the RPM on the right side. It is 950 RPM, and you will see the moment I release the brakes, the plane will start to roll. One thing I have to figure out here is I have to lock the tail wheel and be secure, safe that the tail wheel is actually locked. But look at my hand at the throttle and on the RPM indicator. I do this only here using the brakes. I'm actually not really throttling up or down. And if you look in the lower left corner, you will see the P-51 easily rolls at 900 RPM because it has enough thrust at that setting. Now we are taxiing towards the runway, and there I will take a stop. All the while, note how I actually do not do anything on the throttle. Very important on the real P-51. When you have locked the tail wheel, you must be careful to not use the brakes, or you might actually damage the tail wheel. Now we have a second sequence. Again, note how the plane actually starts to roll the moment I release the brakes. And now I accelerate a little bit with the RPM because I want to accelerate the plane and quickly cross the runway. But note that I rarely go close to 1500 RPM, and once I'm there and have my speed, I immediately throttle back. The real Mustang really easily starts to roll. It's actually a feeling of you constantly feel that you have a little too much plane for the speed you are taxiing at. But the moment you are not idling on the RPM, the plane will actually move forward, and so it takes some time to get used to this. And now for comparison, we now will switch over to DCS. Here we have the cockpit view and the outside view in the lower left hand corner. The plane is set up for takeoff, and now just take a look how I position myself and slowly increase the RPM. I release the brakes, and actually at 900 to 1000 RPM nothing is happening. If I then throttle up a little bit further, the DCS Mustangs very slowly starts to creep forward at around 1150, but it takes at least really 1200, better a little more, to get the plane moving forward. And so let's do that again here. Carefully go onto the brakes and then take a look again at the RPM indicator and how I use the throttle and when the plane starts to actually move. You can see that I very slowly increase the RPM, so you see the moment when the plane starts to move forward. And again, it takes roughly 1250 RPM before the plane is actually moving forward. And you can see I've chosen a concrete runway to make the comparison even, and be assured where the airfield where I flew the real one did not have any slope. Here the same for IL2 now. Again, I tried to replicate the pictures as close as possible. In DCS was a little difficult, so lower left corner you have almost the same view as for the real one, and here I slowly increase the RPM, but the plane doesn't move. We have 1000 RPM now, doesn't move forward at that point, and now just slowly increasing the RPM and waiting for the moment when the plane starts to roll. And you see in IL2 it takes almost 1500 RPM before on a concrete runway the P-51 moves forward. So let's do this again. So you know it's not a one-trick pony. Again, standing still, brakes released, slowly moving up the RPM, and again, when we're coming close to 1500, the plane will start to move. And so here we are. This is the rolling action, the rolling sequence. The conclusion here is quite simple, as you directly saw. The real Mustang very easily rolls at below 1000 RPM, and it will keep its speed. It has actually very few tendencies. If you push the stick forward and unlock the tail wheel to get out of track, you actually need power to turn around the tail. If you do not use power, the plane will stop and sit on the runway or on the taxiway. On the opposite side, you saw here in DCS we already need around 1200 RPM, so there seems to be a little, compared to the real one, there seems to be missing some thrust. And for the IL2 P-51 need even more RPM, and so the thrust there is even less at 900 to 1000 RPM than compared to the real Mustang. So, first sequence finished. Now let's look at the second sequence. Before we start the second sequence, I need to make a couple of remarks about how the civilian Mustang is operated nowadays, because there is rarely high octane fuel available, and Mustangs, as all general aviation airplanes, usually use standard F-gas. The takeoff manifold pressure is limited to 55 inches. So the takeoff configuration we will have here is we will have 6 degrees right rudder trim, we will have 0 degrees elevator and 0 degrees aileron trim. I have taken care that in both DCS and IL2 the planes are in a configuration that will also use those trim settings. So there is no fuel in the fuselage tank, there is no external loads, and where possible, for instance in DCS, I have removed the ammunition so that the plane is actually lighter, because the TF-51 does not have ammunition while we train with it, and so it is a little bit lighter. But for IL2 I also have reduced the fuel load. In the TF-51, the real one, I took off with full fuel tanks, so the weight will not differ too much. At the takeoff we will do a rolling takeoff. So I don't line up on the center line. I'm actually in the holding position right next to the runway. Then we will get the clearance to take off, and then I will roll on, line up the plane with the center line, but will not stop, and then I will throttle up to roughly 14 inches of manifold pressure. We will take care that when the RPM increases and the manifold pressure increases, you hear and look that everything is okay. If that is the case, you proceed with the takeoff, which means once you reached 40 inches, you will let the plane accelerate, and then you will push the throttle forward to 55 inches and get airborne. Pretty quickly after the takeoff, the gear will come up. The description I just gave you will actually take a lot longer than the sequence itself, so be sure to look at the gauges and at the lower left corner so you see what happens and how the real one compares to the other two. So here we are, got the clearance. Again, note how quickly the plane rolls, actually not with real high increase in RPM. Then we accelerate on, have good control. We look for the center line, get on the center line. When we have the center line, I will increase the manifold pressure to 14 inches. I will keep the plane straight, 55 inches, and then I feel for lift, and the Mustang lifts off. After liftoff, landing gear comes up, and then we are good to go. Now the same with DCS. Try to replicate it as close as possible. So we move on, get on the runway, and then I accelerate the plane to 40 inches, get the tail up, and further accelerate to 55 inches to lift off. One thing you will note is, while in the real one I had a little right aileron in to help counter the torque, get the left. I did the same thing here in DCS, and I got a little nick to the right side. But this is not because the torque in the real one is so strong. We will come to that in the conclusion on the takeoff. And here comes up. Everything fine, and we're climbing away. So DCS pretty straightforward. Works more or less exactly the same like the real one. In IL2 we will do the rolling takeoff from the right side of the runway, so we have to turn left. Same here, again, plane starts to roll later than DCS and real one. We line up, make the check, and then we go to 40 something inches, check everything, get the tail up, and accelerate further to 55 inches. And there we lift off. One thing I feel on IL2 is that actually at 55 inches the plane seems to have less acceleration than the real one and the DCS one. Also note how low the speed is here. While in the real one you really have to pull the nose up very high to not exceed the landing gear limiting speed while you're doing 55 inches. So we are at the end of the second sequence, and now let's do some conclusions. The real Mustang. It's actually very easy to take off, I find. The torque is not really an issue. I find it harder to keep both the DCS and the IL2 Mustang straight, because the one thing you have to know about the rudder in the Mustang and is the original Mustang actually had an anti-servo trim tab on the rudder, which means the designers choose an anti-servo tab so that the rudder forces actually were artificially increased so that people do not use too much on the rudder. The reason for that is the rudder on the Mustang is quite effective, and the designers feared people could overstress the airframe in the jaw axis when the rudder forces were too light. on the plane I flew, the trim tab is no longer an anti-servo tab, so the forces on the rudder are actually lower, but the rudder still feels heavy. And it feels heavy for a reason. The rudder is really effective, and you will note that, but you almost do not need a lot of rudder on the Mustang for any condition. And so the movements you do with your feet to keep the plane straight are actually very, very small, especially compared to the T6, where you almost use the entire weight of the rudder pedals to counter the torque and later on the landing keep the plane straight. That's not the case with the Mustang. You do pretty small movements, but the forces are pretty high. And this is actually quite good because you do not over control the plane. It's hard to over control the Mustang. And that is the difficulty on both DCS and IL2. While DCS is a little bit better, you tend to over control both planes, simulations. And so the takeoff is actually a little bit more unstable than with the real one. And I do not really have many, to say it that way. I'm at the point where I have something like 20 takeoffs and go-arounds all together, and so I have a much more takeoff and landings in both flight simulations, but the real plane is easier to handle. So that's the conclusion on the second sequence. Okay, folks, time for the final sequence, the landing. Before we go into the footage itself, we should take a look at which configuration and which procedures we do in the landing, because the landing is actually the most complex of the sequences I show you here, and so it's important that before we take a look at the footage, you know how the landing is flown. The approach to the field is done at 26 inches, 2,300 RPM. It is important to not go below 26 inches so you do not push the engine. What you then do is you aim for 1,000 feet overhead approach. In the case here, I actually first did not have the clearance for 1,000 feet, so I came in at 1,500 feet and got the clearance pretty late, and so had a little excess speed that I had to get rid of. And there's one thing you really have trouble in the Mustang, and that is getting rid of speed. So I did this actually then for both DCS and IL2 also. I came in from 1,500 feet to drop down an overhead approach at 1,000 feet. At 1,000 feet you do the overhead approach, you overfly the threshold and aim for a midfield brake. Just short before the brake, you put down 20 degrees of flaps, and then you do the brake at roughly 45 degree to 60 degree bank angle, so that with the flaps out and the bank and the turn, you create enough drag so that you deaccelerate to below the landing gear limiting speed. When you get into the downwind, you will increase the RPM to 2,700 RPM, which in turn will reduce the manifold pressure to roughly 23 inches, and you put in 4 degrees right rudder trim. You use the elevator trim to counter the trim changes from gear and flaps, and aileron will stay at neutral. The 4 degrees right rudder trim are there so that they prepare you for a possible go-around. Actually, what you do is you fly the plane out of jaw trim. You will, when you have those 4 degrees right rudder rudder trim in there for that possible go-around, you will have to keep the bolt straight using left rudder. And when you get slow and low on the final approach, you need quite a lot of left rudder. And the interesting part here, a little sneak peek, I used DCS to train the procedures, and I did it with 4 degrees right rudder trim, and I always wondered that on final I had to put in pretty much left rudder to keep the plane straight, and I thought that cannot be the real case. There must be something wrong with DCS. But I can assure you, it's the real thing. In reality, you have to put in also a good deal of left rudder to keep the plane straight. And as I said earlier, the rudder in the Mustang is pretty heavy. So then when you're in downwind and configured properly, you turn into base, put it down 30 degrees of flaps and aim for roughly 130 knots. Then you come to final, put in 40 degrees of flaps and aim for 120 knots. And finally, on short final, you want to be full flaps, landing gear down, 3 green lights and 100 to 110 knots. Then you go for a wheel landing, a 2-pointer. And what is a little strange, you almost do not flare. You come in and you come in basically, if you have done everything right, you will not have touched the throttle, so you will have about 23 inches there. And then you slowly throttle back and patiently let the plane settle down on its main wheels. And ideally, the moment you are at idle, the wheels touch the ground. And the good thing about the Mustang is if you do it that way, you do not really need to pin the plane on the runway. It will just stay there. And then you fly the tail down to the runway, try to keep the plane straight. You have to remember, and that's you will notice this here, I'm not having so much time in the plane, you have to counter that right rudder trim, because the plane has a tendency at that point to go right, and you have to keep enough left rudder in so you are not wandering off to the right side. It's pretty much controllable, but you will see it. And so now let's just go into the sequence. You see here we come in lined up with the runway, 26 inches, 2300 RPM. And I want you to remember those procedures and especially look in DCS and IL2 how the planes behave there. Because they are the difference shows, I can tell you. So now we are over the threshold, 1000 feet. Shortly the flaps will go down to 20 degrees, there you see them. And then we go into the brake. Keep our altitude. Through the brake we will reduce our speed. Prop goes to 2700 RPM and we will put in 4 degrees right rudder trim, and we will slightly change the elevator trim so the nose heaviness when you put down the gear and the flaps is counted. So now we're in the downwind. We will have to secure that our gear limiting speed is there and we're below it. And then the gear goes down. And we'll lock. And then we turn into base, aim for 130 knots and put down some more flaps, 30 degrees here. And as I said, you're not touching the throttle there. You basically, if you have judged your altitude right and timed your turn to base properly, you won't need to touch the throttle. You control your airspeed completely over the flaps. And so you here now 40 degrees. Final turn, the turn to final. And then on final we go full flaps and check that the landing gear is down, 3 greens. Fly the plane to the ground. And as you will see, the nose attitude really does not change much. It's a very awkward feeling. It feels almost like you're flying the plane into the ground. And then you ease back the throttle and slowly increase, very slightly increase the back pressure you see here. And then the plane settles down. Then we need to keep the straight and fly the tail back to the ground. And you see how the plane went a little bit to the right. It constantly tries to, and that is because I'm not yet fully used to that heavy left foot. I need to counter the 4 degrees right rudder trim. But you see, it's actually not, the movements is very smooth. So it's not pretty nervous. So, done with the real one. Now we go into DCS. And DCS is really good here. So, you also come in, you see power setting 26 inches, 2300 RPM, and we go for the overhead approach. I lower the flaps, then go into the brake. Keep an eye out for the manifold pressure when I increase the RPM to 2700, because in DCS the manifold pressure goes down. Also very important, the nose attitude. Everything here from the look, the reference, it's pretty... I cannot really see a difference between the DCS Mustang and the real one. Here you now downwind. Gear goes down, I trim the plane 4 degrees right rudder and configure it for the landing. Also the necessary trim changes are very subtle, so you can see that there at the trim wheel, and now I go for the base. The only trouble I so far have in DCS, because the real one has an indicator in knots and DCS has an indicator in miles per hour, I tend to fly 5 to 10 knots too slow in DCS, because I maybe should just make a little pin note to my desktop and there have the numbers written in correctly written and calculated, because usually I underestimated the factor. Here we are on final, gear is down in the D10 3 greens, flaps are fully down, and here the speed now actually pretty much is spot on. The landing, the touchdown is almost too good, and because that's one, when we come to the conclusion, one weakness in DCS. But here you will actually see I do it more or less the same way, and the touchdown itself when the main wheel settle is almost perfect. So here throttling back, and then being patient, and the plane settles down on the main wheels. And here you see one thing, you tend to over control in DCS, and so the plane is actually more nervous. You see it wobbles left to right more. And the second thing is that the brakes are too strong, and that's at the end. Now I will go a little to the right and the tail will come up, and that's something I don't think I can do that with the normal Mustang brakes. And now we are here in IL2, and IL2 we will have to go into the deep in the conclusion. Keep an eye out for the elevator trim, that's why I choose that strange camera perspective, and keep an eye out for the manifold pressure when I go to 2700 RPM. The most notable thing is actually really the trim changes when I pull down the flaps and put down the gear, and you have to take a look how much the trim wheel moves. We're here in the overhead brake, and it really feels, the IL2 Mustang here does not feel like the real one. We will come in details in the conclusion here, but I actually have quite a lot of trouble keeping the altitude, because the nose attitude does not fit. So here, speed for the gear goes down, and I really have trouble keeping the altitude, and I really have to put in a lot of back elevator trim. And so the speed control and altitude control, also the plane does not really, is not, the elevator is much too sensitive. It's not overall a good feeling. And not really. The approach is not as stable as in the real one. Here we come in now to final configuration is there, and as I said, I have trouble controlling my sink rate, and here a little bit too low actually, and the nose attitude, but the nose attitude does simply not fit. And I come in and I try the same here with wheel landing. Speed is actually quite good here. So now, but you see the from here to the outside reference, the nose is actually too high. And so here we touch down, works pretty well, but then it gets pretty bumpy here. And you see the same slight over controlling in the rudder, in the jaw axis. And the same with the brakes. Or the same here, the brakes are a little too effective. So this is the sequence of IL2. And now we can come to and stop, and we can come to the conclusion. Take a look here, that is important. Take a look at that trim wheel. This is way out of trim. So sequence ends here, and now we can take a look at what are my conclusions. So now we have gone through all three sequences, and it's time for a short conclusion and summary. First, let me state the real Mustang is a real pilot's plane, very controllable. The torque, you have to respect it, but it's not so much of an issue as most people will think. And the plane gives you confidence, and some features are like the placement of the trim wheels and how you actually can use them in real life with just your left hand, and how that becomes second nature when you change the attitude of the plane is ingenious to say. And now let's get to the flight simulations. DCS is almost spot on. There are little issues with you saw that how the plane handles on the ground and when it starts to actually roll, but overall I can fly the DCS Mustang with the procedures from the real one, with the values from the real one, and it shows the same behavior. Sure, the feeling of the plane will depend a lot on the hardware you actually use, your joystick, your rudders, and your throttle, and the side picture if you're using VR. Here it's also positive to say that in VR the scale of DCS is very close, also almost spot on to the real one, and the side picture is also correct, which then in turn, so DCS is really great. And if you want to get possibly as close currently for no bugs at all to the real one, and you have a simulation rig at home with a VR headset, get DCS World 2.5 and fly the TF51. I can just say that's it. Which brings me to IL2, and IL2 is really disappointing here. It shows that IL2's flight model itself seems to have issues. I've noted them before with other planes, but I did not really have a reference for that, but now I really have a reference. You saw this, there are issues with the ground handling too. You need even more thrust before the plane moves, but if that would be the only point, forget about that. Takeoff very similar to DCS actually, with the exception that I have the feeling or that on 55 inches the plane actually does not accelerate as it should. You don't really get into the danger of overshooting the landing gear speed, and so there just seems to miss some oomph, some power in the engine. But the real issues show up when you do landing procedures, when you do patterns, when you start to go into cruise flight. I've not included cruise flight video footage here. That would be boring, just flying straight. But there are the one main thing that seems to be an issue with the P-51 and IL2 is actually the elevator axis. It is much too sensitive. The trim forces on the elevator axis are extremely excessive. You have to trim so much forward, backward. It has nothing in common with the real plane. On the real plane, the elevator trim is much more sensitive, and you just need a lot less to move it to get the result you want. Also, the side picture of the IL2 P-51 seems to be a little off, because in the real Mustang you tend to constantly climb because the nose is so low on the horizon that when you come from other planes, you have to get used to that side picture with that nose so low. And in IL2 it's actually the other way around. I'm constantly finding myself, when I try to go for a cruise flight or level flight, I'm constantly sinking because I'm putting the nose where I think it should be, and the plane is actually losing altitude. So there's something wrong with the side picture, which makes also landing and approaches difficult, because the plane also always tends to sink. There, as you saw in the landing procedures, also something with the engine modeling is not working properly, because when you increase the RPM, the manifold pressure does not go down, which it should, because the real one I flew, and the DCS one that is there, and the IL2 have actually the same mixture control, the latest version, which only has 2 positions, and so they should show the same behavior, but they don't. I won't say much about the wheel landings. It's one thing, and the DCS landing was too perfect at that point, but it seems both simulations here, same with the ground handling, are a little bit too sensitive. Same with keeping the plane straight on the runway. But if you ask me, long story short, which of those 2 simulations you should fly when you want to experience the Mustang, then it's DCS. And when you just want to have beautiful graphics but want to fly around with something that, except from the 3D model, has very few in common with a real plane, then you can choose IL2. And that's the way it is. I hope you found that video interesting, and this comparison was something for you. Always happy hunting and happy landing, folks, and see you again here in the future at Agathos Flight School. Bye bye.